Welcome back. Let's get stuck into the overview for today. I'll be honest, in that break, I was very tempted to make myself a coffee, but didn't think that 20 minutes into the lecture was the right time to break open a coffee. So I will treat myself at some point through this recording of the lecture to a coffee. You'll see me coffee in hand, happy. I mean, I'm happy now. I'm just not caffeinated. Actually, I did have a coffee today. No, I'm happy caffeinated, but just not maximally caffeinated is the thing. The focus of today is all about the research process. We'll talk about types of surveys, survey design, levels of measurement, sampling, and biases. And I really hope that from today's lecture, you get an appreciation of the artistry that goes behind survey design. It's a science and it's an art, and it really requires deep thinking about not only what the construct is that you're trying to measure effectively, but how people interpret that and the factors that could bias that process. And so we'll go through a lot of this in detail. For survey administration methods, we can start there. We've sort of hinted at this in our examples, but there's two key administration methods. They include if it's self-administered or if it's interview administered. So self-administered can take a whole host of formats. It can be postal administered. It can be administered where it's delivered to you and then collected at a later date. And it can be online, which is probably the most common form of self-administered survey. So email, mobile, or web interface that's requesting you to complete the survey. Now, the interview-administered survey can occur via phone or face-to-face structured interview. And so when we're thinking about self-administered versus interview-administered, you may be wondering, well, why would I do an interviewed administered over a self-administered and vice versa? And so typically the pros of one of these approaches is the con of the other approach. So for self-administered surveys, they're excellent because they lower cost and time. Just imagine you're a researcher, you maybe don't have the costs available or financial resources available to pay for a lot of people to go out and collect that data through interviewed administered surveys. And so you're wondering, what should you do? You may not have a lot of time as well. And that's where you design your survey, you click a button when you have an email address list of your sample for your population group, and you automatically have access to all of them. It's ecologically valid and you're able to obtain that data. So that's lower cost and time. There's less demand characteristics. And what I mean by demand characteristics is when people are doing a survey face to face, they may get a sense of what the aim of the survey is or aim of the study is. And it can take two forms. One is you could be the type of participant who says, oh, the researcher, I think they want to investigate this, or looking at the ways they're asking these questions. Let me fill out in a way that allows them to achieve what they want to achieve. And this is like a pleasing characteristic. The other form as well that can occur when these demand characteristics are present and they start to work out what's behind the survey and the purpose, they can just completely fill the opposite answer. The problem with both of these avenues is that what we're trying to assess is actually the person's true response. And so these demand characteristics are less evident in a survey where they just receive the information and they have to complete it, and they're not interacting with someone who may be inferring the purpose of the study as a function of that. You get access to a representative sample because of the ways in which you're able to disseminate that survey. So that's a really, really powerful tool. And you get anonymity. So people don't have to provide their details when they're completing a survey. If it's face-to-face, whilst they may not need to provide their details for your study, they also know that you know who they are. And so it's very difficult to have that anonymity in that face-to-face interaction. Whereas on a survey, if the survey says we don't collect your data and they don't store your name, your email address, or any identifying information, then you're able to complete it as is anonymous. And that can be great for a few factors, but the key one is that you're able to, people may be more free to talk about how they actually behave or think or their attitudes. Whereas if someone's in front of them, they may change those responses to not feel like the person is maybe judging them as much. So this is excellent. Um, but the pros of interviewed administered surveys, yes, it's still ecologically valid in this context, because you're going to their place of where they live to administer the survey. Now you can get a higher response rate, and so what I mean by this is when people complete the survey or say yes, they want to do the survey, typically they go all the way through that process. Also, they may be more likely to say yes if they see you in person versus if it's an email and it says, hey, can you complete our survey? There's higher data quality and richness, and that what by that I mean the data itself is they're more likely to complete all of that data, and also in terms of how the data is recorded. So if it's a remember, the surveys aren't always quantitative. It's not just filling out boxes. You can also have them report information back to you. And so in an interview administered survey, you could have a recording available where they're able to actually just speak into a microphone naturally, rather than trying to synthesize their ideas in text, which could be misinterpreted by the researcher. It can accommodate for cultural awareness as well when the survey is administered face to face. And an example of this could be in terms of how surveys are administered in indigenous populations. It's I think less likely that you're going to have the self-administered surveys. More likely it would be interviewed with someone from the community who actually provides that pathway to allow you to interact with others and connect with them. So there are ways in which the interviewed administered surveys really acknowledge the culture of the people and ensure that you're not breaching any cultural norms there. And then finally, it's suitable for children and people of lower literacy ability. So when I say children, think of children under the age of 5 who can speak, articulate ideas and thoughts, but they cannot necessarily write. And so people of lower literacy who aren't able, if there's dense text that they have to read, they're not able to really process this in a way to understand it and provide a adequate response, which is important for ethics because you have to ensure that the patient or participant has informed consent. And so to guarantee that, you need to make sure that they have a level of literacy that they're able to consent to it. And that's where the use of self-administered can be useful in some populations, but definitely not others. If I handed out a survey about the effect of consuming lots of lollies before bed amongst children, well, I say, hey, would you like to do this survey about this topic? They may all say yes. It's not necessarily informed through that process versus, of course, with children, you need an adult to consent or a guardian, a parent or a guardian there. But in the sense of the consent process is important to consider when it's either through written form, if they have lower literacy or not. Are they able to understand what they're saying yes to? I said this at the very beginning because it's one of the most critical points. It is a science and an art, and you'll get an appreciation for this as this lecture goes on. But you got to take it in steps. So there's this pre-testing phase, and then the pilot testing, which is important, and pay attention to the structure, layout, and flow. And so we'll see this in a moment here when it comes to survey construction. So what are the steps to take? Well, when you want to create a generic survey. So you have separate sections for each of your objectives. So you may say, I want to measure personality, and you have a section about personality. You want to measure procrastination. You have a section about procrastination. And then you want to expand it where you're starting to draft questions and response formats under each of those sections. And think about the question order. Think about, do the questions that I have here, do they influence how people could respond later? If there are typical survey patterns or behaviors where people drop off as the survey goes on, what are the questions I would love them to complete first, which would allow me to actually use their data if they allow for that data to be used, but they just don't finish the survey. You then go through the process of pre-testing, pilot testing, and then redrafting, which we'll go through in detail in a moment, and then finalize the survey and collect data, which is the exciting part. I mean, it's all exciting, but this is when you get data from a survey, that can be very exciting. So the pre-testing is where you recruit a small convenient sample to pre-test your items. Have them talk through their thoughts on each question and give feedback as they go. Really, in survey research that I've been a part of, when you do that pre-testing, often it starts with collaborators, like research collaborators. You send them the survey to complete and then provide their thoughts and feedback as to how they experience completing that survey, but also how they think other participants may experience that process and what challenges may arise. So that's really, really critical when it comes to designing that survey, because oftentimes is always the case where you write questions and it's very clear to you what that question means and how it should be answered appropriately. But then often at times you'll find actually you're not giving them an option to actually respond adequately, or it could be misinterpreted where they're responding in a way that doesn't necessarily align with how you intended them to respond. And really what happens is, if these things are not done and then you administer the survey to your sample of choice and you collect all of that data, the item, which is the part of the survey that relates to that question, may not be usable. And so that's really what you want to avoid. You're putting all the effort into designing the survey. You're at the time of the participants to complete the survey. You want to ensure you get it as close as possible to correct as you can. That's why these steps are really important. In the pre-testing, you revise items when they don't apply to everyone. So you may find that actually for some people, they don't necessarily, it doesn't apply to them, the question. And in that case, you could keep the question and have them skip over to the next question and not make it a mandatory field to complete. Again, you can see this as an issue in survey design. If you've forced it to be a mandatory item to complete and it doesn't apply to someone, and for them to continue, they actually need to create a response. So then you'll get some fabricated data just for them to progress. If the item is redundant, so what I mean by that is if it's actually being measured in multiple ways and other ways across the survey, is it necessary to include? If you can revise a question if it's likely to be misunderstood, or also if it's incomplete. So you want to overall, you want to reconsider the ordering and layout of the overall survey through this process of pre-testing. So in pilot testing, this is where you actually recruit a small sample from the target population. Then you analyze the data and you revise the survey. So you're really going through the process as to how it would happen at scale, but just at a very, very small level. And then if that all goes smoothly, you have some assurance that when you do it on a larger scale, it's likely to work out well. And this is great if you use something like R. You can write the code for your analyses that you would likely do in this context. And then when you administer the survey, you collect the data, which is data set's going to be larger, but the code will all be the same. You just import that data, press a button, and it runs everything. So it can be quite an efficient process as well if you're using R that writes syntax for you, rather than, but the focus of pilot testing is really to identify any key issues that may emerge in the either, again, interpretation of the questions, maybe it wasn't picked up in the pre-testing phase, or in terms of the analysis. So an example, and we'll talk about levels of measurements later, but an example could be you had thought of a measure and you wanted it to be continuous, but it actually maybe worked better categorically or vice versa. And this is important to consider. So what's the physical structure of a survey? You have a title page, what the survey is, the title of it, participant information sheet. This tells the participant what they need to know about the survey and feeds into their informed consent, so that they know what's required of them, how their data will be used, how the data will be stored, in what ways, or what's the purpose of the research, what will the research be published in a journal? Will it be disseminated elsewhere? And then what the instructions are for completing the survey. Then you have the survey, the questionnaire, which is separated into sections with items relating to each objective. And then the end page, which is a debrief section, which says, thank you for participating. If you want to provide your email address, we can keep you in the loop with how the research progresses once we collect all the data. So that's really the broad structure of a survey that you'll see for most research surveys. What are things to consider? You really want to keep it clear, simple, and easy to navigate. I can't overemphasize this enough, and this is where it comes back to some of those points we mentioned for the are there redundant items or too many questions. You really want to ensure it's super concise. So the survey is assessing what needs to assess and nothing further, because the risk, particularly in a self-administered survey, of someone not finishing it is so high that you want to ensure that you maximize their time to get the most value for the data that's there. So keep it clear, simple, easy to navigate. Any of these things that aren't clear or simple or easy to navigate, you'll have people drop out and just not do the survey. You want to use a large, easy to read font. Some suggestions are 14-point and non-serif, but really something that's clear. And this is through the pre-testing and pilot testing. You can get a sense of that. How do they find the readability of the survey as well? You can typically keep it as high contrast in terms of the survey, and number each question so people know. Some people put a progress bar as well to either give people motivation for understanding how far through the survey they are, and try to minimize the number of pages or just minimize the overall length of the survey where possible. Every piece of data that you collect in a survey, you should be asking yourself, do I need to collect this piece of information? Is it necessary for the project? Because everything that you add to it blows out the survey and can lead to things that are not completed adequately. And again, when it comes to this, this is where certain design features of having people be able to skip through parts of surveys that don't apply to them rather than saying NA, so that's in the design of the structure, can be really effective tools. So for the participant information, you're looking for the name of your study, the purpose of the study, what's required from the participant, emphasizing that participation is voluntary and participants can withdraw at any time. So throughout the process, they feel comfortable to withdraw. Risks, costs, rewards of the survey, what you're going to do with the results. You want to include your ethics number, which shows to them that it's actually gone through an ethics process and has been approved by ethics, but also allows them to actually search up or follow up if they have any issues or complaints. Ideally, they take that to you first, but it should be there transparently for them. And yeah, how to make a complaint, obtain results, or contact the researcher. So really, we need to be careful when it comes to patient data and what we do with that data. And this it goes to the heart of, in the day and age of generative AI, the ethics of actually putting patient data or participant data into Gen AI. I think there are different cases in which it could be argued yes or no, but my philosophy is that first and foremost, you have to ensure that patients are informed of how their data is going to be used. So if you're going to be using generative AI for analyzing your data, then you need to declare that. My personal belief is that data should not be uploaded into Gen AI systems, just because unless they're localized systems that you've made yourself and you're housing the data locally and you know where that's going, then you can tell the person those features of your data set and use it. But if you're using one of the main AI systems, I think there are some ethical implications of using raw data in those processes. But fundamentally, when it comes to participant information, it's, are you informing the participant of everything that they need to know for completing the survey, for how their data is going to be handled, and how they can lodge a complaint and access the results as well as needed. So how do you get informed consent? There's typically two ways. One is active consent. You actually ask them, do you consent to take part in the survey? And they must indicate whether or not they consent to participate. Or the other one is passive consent, which is where they just provide their consent by continuing on to the survey, which implies consent to participate. And so an example of passive consent I find is used a lot in education, not in terms of research, but in terms of the process of passive consent for teachers. So in high school or primary school, when there's a event that has to happen, such as they're going on an excursion, they'll ask parents, well, we're going to take your child on an excursion. We're going to, if we don't hear from you, we'll assume that you consent to this, but if you do not consent, please let us know. So that's sort of a mixture where it's passive consent, and in some ways, them not responding to the parent, to the teacher, is an indicative of the consent process happening, and they have to actually actively tell them that they don't want to consent, which is in some ways the active consent process. So the process of active consent and passive consent are important to consider when it comes to informed consent. Typically, what I've seen in ethics applications is active consent is you need a justification for why passive consent is required over and above active consent. And more often than not, people should be informing you not through their actions, but through debrief with information as to whether or not they should consent to taking part in the study. What are ethical considerations? So we've talked about informed consent. And I'm going on for a lot of detail for ethics because it's just a really critical part of research, and it shouldn't be an afterthought, or it shouldn't be viewed in a compliance lens. It's actually done to protect the participant and the researcher and the integrity of the research that's being done. There's a lot of historical examples of how research was conducted without adequate ethics approval and has led to really detrimental impacts on the person. An example that I watched was a document. I mean, most of them are psychological experiments in the 60s and 50s, prior to rigorous ethical standards. Documentary I watched on, I think it was Three Identical Twins, it was called, where these three triplets were identified to be related, of course, but they were separated at birth, and they didn't know that there was actually a sibling out there, or identical twin or triplet. And so two of them interacted in college, and then another one interacted when it was announced in the newspaper, and the third one identified as them, and they all connected. And then the more they looked into it, they realized actually it was part of a psychological experiment where they were intentionally separated at birth and put into different families of varying levels of socioeconomic status to see the effects on them as individuals. So extreme examples, but a really good reminder of the importance of ethics when it comes to data and the impact it can have. So you want to minimize risk of harm, ensure confidentiality or anonymity when possible. In some cases, it's not possible for the data to be anonymous, or not in the sense of the research being done, but in terms of the collection of the data process, and that's okay. It's just ensuring that the participant knows how their data will be handled. Ensuring there's no coercion coming through the process of collecting data, so people don't feel pressured to participate. There's minimal deceit and a full debrief. The reason why I said minimal deceit is because in some research, deception is in part of the research design, and you're trying to see how people behave in those contexts. But that's where there's actually rigorous ethical review to ensure that it's done appropriately, and there's adequate debrief that occurs in those contexts. But full debrief should happen everywhere. You want to honor a promise to provide the results, so ensure that if you say that you are going to provide the results to people, you do, and be aware of any bias or conflicts of interest that may emerge through the process of conducting that research. So those are the key ethical considerations to keep in mind. For the instructions, it's important for ensuring consistency. and few people read these without prompting. If you are doing a self-administered survey, one thing you can do, which can help people, help you as a researcher get assurance that people know what's happening in the instructions, is actually give them a quick quiz. So they read the instructions and you give them a quiz, and if they don't pass the quiz, then maybe they don't get to do the survey. Of course, this has implications in compliance, but it really does ensure that people are reading the information. Explain how to do the survey in a really simple way. And again, you can explain it, or you could have them do sort of a pre-survey survey where they're filling out questions and sort of they don't contribute to the actual survey responses, and they can get a sense and feel for how the interface works and how they're completing that survey. And yeah, sometimes examples help make this clearer. Excellent. So background information, usually at the start or end of the survey, is the background information, and ask for personal information that are justified by the research question. That's really, really important. In so many surveys, you see people asking for the person's personal information when it has nothing to do with the purpose of the study or how the data will be analyzed. And so the question is, why is that data being obtained? And so if you don't need to obtain the data, then you shouldn't be obtaining the data, is the key takeaway. Also ask for demographic information to help people judge how representative the sample is. So in some cases, that's where you're taking that data. Excellent. So when you're ordering questions, you want to start gently so that you're easing your participant in. You don't want to really make it too difficult at the start, or else they'll unlikely to complete it. Group similar questions together, so ensure that the questions are groups so that they have that theme, and think about ordering effects. Now, we're going to go into this in a moment, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you guys a break there. So we'll stop the recording. I might treat myself to a coffee, and then we'll come back ready to get stuck into some order effects. Okay, I'll see you guys very soon.